Welcome endgame fans. In this video, the Worldsman would like to show you two of the most common mistakes that are made in Rook and Pawn endings. Now, one of these mistakes is often made by the attacking side, while the other is typically made by the defending side. Now, both of these themes have been covered previously in separate videos. What this presentation does is to combine them in a discussion of a position drawn from tournament play. As ever, the example is chosen for its instructive value, recognizing that players of all levels commit and can learn from errors. The position on the board arose in a game between two Dutch players, and it was played in the BDO Grandmaster Premier at Haarlem in 2010. With the white pieces was Peng, a Grandmaster and the highest rated female player in the Netherlands, winner of the Dutch Women's Championship 13 times. Her opponent, playing black, was Grandmaster Benjamin Bok, the current Dutch number 2, behind Anish Giri. At the time this game was played, though, Benjamin Bok was only 15 years old, and he was not yet an international master. Okay, well, having met the players, let's check out the position. It's Bok to play, and he's a pawn up. White's problem is her king is on the e5 square, which is a long way from the queening square on g1. And in addition, the white king is cut off currently along the f-file by the black rook. But there are some positives in this position, though. Black's extra pawn is a knight's pawn. And as we've seen in the Worldsman videos, knight's pawns give the defending side some more options, typically, than let's say bishop's pawn would. And in addition, the pawn is currently on the third rank, so it's not very far advanced. Now, white also has another asset in this position, and that is the rook on a1. And this rook is very well placed, and currently the rook controls the first rank. Okay, so the question is, well, how should black proceed from here? Now, if you'd like to consider this problem, pause the video. Okay, well, welcome back if you decided to have a go analysing this one. Now, in the game, Bok proceeded with rook e2 check. This was not the best move in the position, and in fact this tempting check was a mistake. Now, what would have been decisive here was the move rook f4. And this is a powerful move because it cuts white's king off along the fourth rank. A failure to grasp the opportunity of cutting a defender's king off along a rank is a common error made by the attacking side in rook and pawn endings. And even titled players occasionally make this slip. After rook f4, the win is far from trivial, but black can in fact force a win from this position. Well, let's consider the following line. Let's see what happens if white gives a check with rook g1. Black's rook interposes. So the white rook goes to the h-file, trying to stop the black king from making progress. But again, the black rook can interpose and go rook h4. After white tries rook g1 check again, then white goes king h5. And now the point is that if white goes king f6, attacking g6, then black can drive the king back with rook f4 check. And after king e5, he advances the pawn with g5. So black has made some progress, but the win is still far from trivial. And the best try here is for white to go back with rook a1. And now the winning method is not obvious at all. Well, let's consider a couple of tries for black. Let's first of all consider what happens if black tries to advance his king with king h4. Well, this goes nowhere because of the checking distance. White can go rook h1 check, and after king g4, white can go rook g1 check. And this checks the black king and attacks the g5 pawn. And after king h5, defending the pawn, well, white simply goes back with rook a1 and black has made no progress. Okay, so let's just consider then another option. So instead of the move king h4, what happens if black tries rook b4? Well, the problem with this is that the f5 square is available to white's king, and that's what white plays here. He goes king f5, she goes king f5, and now the threat is to go rook h1 check, winning. Well, in fact, winning the pawn after rook h4. White then goes rook g1. So she has to go back with rook f4 check, and then king e5 repeats the position. And again, black has made no progress. So what black needs to do is to find a move that enables him to improve the position, and this is going to involve moving the rook away from its station on f4. So the question is, well, where should the black rook go? Well, a mistake is to try rook f2, and the problem with this move is white goes rook h1 check, black goes king g4, white goes rook g1 check again, king has to go back. So the king can't come forward in this line because white controls f4. So instead, after rook h1 check, the king has to go back to g6. And now white's king is able to cross the fourth rank. White can go king e4. Okay, so what we have here is an example of frontal defense, and we'll consider a position similar to this later in the video. And you might also want to check out the two videos in the series that the Waltzman has made on the frontal defense. So white has improved her position sufficiently to hold this. So rook f2 is not the desired solution to the problem. So black must find another rook move. Now there are several options available, but the best technique is to withdraw the rook all the way to f8. And again, this looks strange because it's lifting the blockade on white's king. The rook is no longer cutting the king off along the fourth rank. But on closer inspection, it turns out that the white king shouldn't cross the line, because if white goes king e4 here, then black can go g4. And if white goes king e3, then the g-pawn just keeps rolling. It goes g3. So this defense is no good. So instead, white could try this familiar idea of going rook h1 check. And now the black king does not come forward. If black goes king g4, then white can just drive the king back again with rook g1 check. But instead, black's king retreats to g6. Well, there's nothing better for white than to attack the g-pawn with rook g1. And now black goes rook f4, cutting the king off along the fourth rank. And as we've seen previously, the best try here is to go rook a1. So now we have the same position as we had a few moves ago. The only difference is that black's king is on g6 rather than h5. And this means that black controls the f5 square. And it means that in this position, rook b4 works, whereas previously it didn't work because because white had the move king f5. So there's a subtle difference in the position, and this is quite hard to spot in an over-the-board game. So let's see what might happen after the further moves. Rook f1, black advances g4, and now a good try is to go rook f4, hoping that black will exchange rooks, but that would be a mistake because rook takes rook here leads to a drawn king and pawn ending. But instead black has the winning move rook b5 check, and after king e4 black goes king h5, and now black is making real progress. White has to go rook f8. There are only 3 ranks now, so a frontal defense is not going to be effective. So instead white tries attacking from the rear. But black has time to go king h4, and after king f4 black has the check from distance, rook b4, white goes king e3, black king keeps coming, goes king h3, and after rook h8 check, king g2, the Lucina formation is looming, and this is one for black. Okay, well let's go back to the game. So instead of rook f4, as we saw, Bog's choice was rook e2 check, and this was a mistake because although the rook check drives white's king back a file, it also permits the white king to come forward by a rank. And since the chessboard is 2 dimensions, the check is not effective. Black is achieving much less than it appears. And black's problem is going to be the fact that he has a knight's pawn that's only on the 3rd rank, whereas white's rook is very well placed on a1, controlling the 1st rank. So after the rook check, white went king d4, and black replied with king f4 opposing kings. And in this position, Peng also went wrong. She played the move here king d3, attacking the rook. And that was tempting, but an error. And what she should have gone for was deploying a frontal defense. She should have played the move rook f1 check here. And the point of this move is that were black to reply with king g3, then rook g1 check is an immediate draw. And if the king moves away, the g6 pawn is lost. While if black interposes rooks with rook g2, then white simply trades the rooks and plays king e4. And she's going to pick up the g pawn anyway. And that'll just leave bare kings. And so the game is a draw. Now failure to take the opportunity of mounting a 1st rank or a frontal defense is the most common mistake that the defending side makes in rook and pawn endings. Well, let's just go back. So in this position, after rook f1 check, black does have a better winning attempt available, but it's not sufficient. So instead of king g3, it's better to play king g5, retreating. White keeps up the 1st rank checks. She goes rook g1 check. Black retreats further with king f6. White goes rook f1 check. And now black's king retreats behind the pawn with king g7. So white now attacks the rook with king d3. Black rook retreats. So there's still some hope here because white's king is cut off along the e-file, and that's 2 files distance from the passed g-pawn. But it's not going to be enough to win. But white has to be accurate. So let's say white plays a waiting move here, king d2. The pawn advances. White immediately attacks the pawn with rook g1, that's important. And so black defends the pawn with king g6. And in this position, there's only one move that holds the draw. And you have to realize that in this position, black is threatening to go rook e4, which is a very good square for the rook. So white goes king d3, preventing the rook from reaching e4. And now black can't force a win. For example, if black goes rook f8, white goes king e2, rook f4, then white can wait with rook a1. And here, if black goes g4, then white has got this rook f4 move. And just a reminder of the three defensive ideas that you have with the frontal defense: attacking the passed pawn from the front, offering to exchange rooks into a drawn king and pawn ending, which is the point of rook f1, and checking from distance. These are the three key defensive ideas, and they work against knight's pawns, but they can fail against bishop's pawns or center pawns. So check out the videos in the Waldsman series to find out more about this very important defensive idea, the frontal defense. Okay, well, let's go back to the game. So after Bock opposed kings with king f4, as we've seen, Peng played the move king d3, so she passed up the opportunity to mount a frontal defense. Now, there are several ways that Bock could have won this position. Now, a straightforward approach, I think, would have been to just play the move rook e3 check here. And after king d2, then black has time to advance the pawn with g5. And the point is that here, the move rook f1 check no longer works because black can interpose rooks with rook f3. And now trading rooks isn't an option because remember the crucial three squares in front of a passed pawn that are, one rank ahead of the pawn, or rather 2 ranks. Here they're f3, g3, and h3. And if the attacker controls any one of those squares, then you can always force a win, even if the defending king is on the queening square g1. And in this position, white's king is very far from that square. So rook f3 would force a win here. So that's one of the ways in which black might have forced the win from here. But instead, Bock met an error with an error, and he played another tempting move. He played rook e6. And the idea of this move is to defend the pawn on g6. But it's not an effective move because black is going backwards in the position. And in particular, the problem for black is that now rook f1 check does work, and that's the move that was played in the game. So after rook f1 check, black can go king g3 because g6 is protected. But the problem is that although white's king is cut off by 2 files from the passed pawn, it's still in a position to attack. And what white can play here is the move king d4, going after the rook. The white's king suddenly turns nasty. And were black to attack white's rook with king g2, then white can go rook f4. And that's a very effective move. It prevents g5. And if black goes king g3, white simply goes back with rook f1. So that's no good. While if black advances with g5, then white can go rook g1 check. And there's sufficient distance between the pawn and the first rank to mount a frontal defense. So black goes back with king f4 protecting the pawn. White checks again with rook f1. Black goes king g4. White just keeps checking with rook g1. King f5. Rook f1 check. King g6. And now it's important to attack the pawn. White goes rook g1, attacking g5. And here we have another example of white mounting a successful frontal defense. This is one of the ideal setups. And check out the videos on frontal defense to find out a bit more about this resource. Okay, let's go back. So unfortunately for Peng, she didn't realize that her king could be used as an attacking piece in this position. So instead of king d4, she went for the check rook g1. And that's just no longer effective because g6 is defended. So she fell in with black's plans. And what Bog did was to play king f2, and now he's able to close down the white rook. Notice how his king suddenly is attacking, is being aggressive in the position. White's rook stayed on the attack of the g-pawn, went rook g5. Black played king f3. Again, the idea is to close down the rook and also to oppose kings. So a useful move. White returned with rook g1. And now black has time to go rook d6 check, forcing white's king further away from the passed pawn. And once the king gets 3 files away from the passed pawn, then it's no longer possible to hold this position. King c4 happened. Black went king f4, threatening g5. So white gave a check with rook f1. Black went king e3. White decided to try and do something, so she attacked the rook with king c5. But the rook just fell back to d8 out of harm's way. And that's another idea of this move, is that after white went rook g1, she was able to get a rook behind the passed pawn with g8, which is what you want to do if you're the attacker. So now black's pieces are beautifully coordinated, whereas white's king is offside and detached from the rook, so white can't mount an effective defense. And the game concluded as follows: white went king d5, black pushed g5, white went king e5, black pushed again, g4, white went king f5, but the pawn just kept going. He went g3, and after king e5, white decided that she'd seen enough and resigned the game. Okay, well, if you haven't seen them, you might like to check out the Waldsman's other videos on rook and pawn endings, particularly the ones dealing with the frontal defense. Or try and find some other videos or some endgame books that discuss this very important resource. And good luck in your own games, and keep alert for chances to cut off your opponent's king along a rank if you're attacking, and to apply a first rank defense or a frontal defense with your rook if you're defending. Thanks for watching.